Hello and welcome back to All You Can Board. My name is Carlo and today I'm going to be reviewing Cascadia. So this is a first-time design by Randy Flynn with illustrations by Beth Sobel, and this is co-published by Flatout Games and AEG. So this is an excellent game that just got released last year, 2021, and it's kind of a tough game for me to review because the first few times I played it, I really enjoyed it, but I couldn't really put my finger on why. I mean, it has some very simple rules, and I knew right away it was a game I was going to like, but there was something about it that just felt near perfect, and I struggled for a while to pinpoint what it was until recently, after a few more plays, and I realized it's because the level of randomness in this game is so well executed, and I think that's truly the standout aspect of it that kind of flew under the radar for me a little bit at first. I'm going to talk about a few other things during the review, but I'm going to be focusing mostly on the aspect of randomness and how that makes this game so good, because it makes every turn, every choice that you make difficult, and it truly does matter. So before we get into that, though, I'm going to tell you kind of a basic overview of how the game plays in case you're not too familiar with Cascadia. So in this game, each player starts with one of these three-sided hexagonal tiles. They're called starting habitat tiles, basically. And on your turn, you basically have 4 options on the main board. There's going to be 4 more of these habitat tiles that are just single ones. Some of them have, one type of land. Others might have 2 or 3 different types of land on them. And then you have these wildlife tokens. On your turn, you're basically picking a set or a pair. So either this tile and token, etc. You're taking them, adding the tile to your little personal terrain area, and then placing the wildlife token on one of the hexes that has that animal showing. So as well as the land types, some of these will have 1, 2, or 3 different types of animals. There's 5 different ones in the game. So let's say I take this tile and this token. You add the tile somewhere, doesn't matter. There's no placement restrictions, unlike in other tiling games like Carcassonne where all the sides have to line up. You can put this wherever you want as long as it's adjacent to a previous tile of yours. And then you're going to add the wildlife token to one of the habitat spots that can basically hold that animal. Then you're going to take a new tile and token from the bag and add them to the display, and then the next person's going to go. You're just going to go around the table doing that. Every player is going to get 20 turns, and then at the end of the game, you're going to count points and see who wins. So the points are scored mostly from these wildlife scoring cards. There's one for each type of animal, and in the box there's, I think, 4 different ones for each animal type. So every time you play, you can mix and match with different ones. Each animal usually has some type of theme or type of kind of way that you're generally trying to score, but each card kind of gives you some different ways. For example, this elk card says scores per straight line of elk. So if you have, 1 elk or 2 or 3 or 4, depending if it's in a straight line, you get this number of points. Red-tailed hawks need to be not next to any other hawks, so you just want to have them spaced out. And you can see you can get a maximum of 26 points if you have 8 or more. So they all have these different kind of scoring conditions that are going to point you in different directions. So that's where the majority of your points are going to come from. You're also going to get 1 point for every nature token you have left at the end of the game. You gain those by placing an animal token or wildlife token on what's called a keystone tile. So a keystone tile is something like this, where it just has the single land type and single animal. And if you place that animal on it, you'll see it has that little leaf symbol on there, and that means you take a nature token, which you can use later to kind of play around with your options a little bit, which I'll get back to in a bit. And then the final thing is, like I said, even though you don't have the restrictions of where you place your tiles, you do want to be lining up your habitats as much as possible, because at the end of the game, for each of the 5 habitat types, you're going to score points, 1 point per tile for your largest grouping of adjacent tiles. So let's say I had 6 tiles that made up this forest, that would be 6 points. So do that for each category. And then you're also going to compare with the other players to see who has the largest size habitat type of each of the types, and each player is who has that majority is going to score a number of points based on player count. So that's pretty much all the rules right there. A couple other subtle things like what you use your nature tokens for. So on your turn, you can trade in a nature token to basically take any combination of a wildlife or a habitat tile and wildlife token. So you can take something, from here and one that doesn't match up with it, and then you just replace them from the bag. You can also spend a nature token to wipe any number of these tiles from the board and replace them with new ones from the bag. So they basically give you some options to kind of help play around with that randomness a little bit and give you some new options on your turn. I will mention quickly that there's a solo mode for this game as well, and if you're playing solo, you basically there isn't an AI player or anything like that. It's just after you take tiles, the tiles will shift down, you'll remove certain ones from the board, and then you'll add more, so you kind of have a little more control over what's going on, and it's sort of just automated, so it's just a 20-turn game where you're just cycling tiles and tokens out of the market a bit quicker at the end of your turn. Okay, so now let's talk about all the aspects of randomness that come into play, and I might even overlook some here because there's a lot of different ways it comes into play that aren't maybe necessarily obvious right off the bat. So the first one is your starting habitat tile. So there's only 5 of them in the game, but so there's a bit of variety there. There's not too much, but right off the bat you're going to get a random tile, so you don't have any choice over what you start with. Then there's going to be the random distribution of the habitat tiles and wildlife tokens. So not only are you usually going to see different ones, but they'll be in different combinations as well. So you can't just say from the start without even looking at those, oh, this game I'm going to do this. You got to wait to see what actually comes out on the board. Then there's the randomness of which cards are you using. And again, these are ones where you can just, the rule book has some suggestions as to, play with this combination or play with this combination. So it's not always going to be random, but I find that over time, if you're going to be more experienced with the game, you're probably just going to shuffle them up and pick one out of each category and randomly complete those. So right off the bat, just in terms of the starting setup of the game, what your starting tile is random, the choices that you have in the middle are random, and what your main scoring conditions are going to get you points for a lot of the time are going to be random as well. The other thing I'll mention is if you're playing with 4 players, you use all the tiles, but anything less than 4 players, and you randomly remove a certain number of the tiles and leave them back in the box so that you can't, if somehow you were had memorized all the tiles, you had some idea of which tiles had come out and what types of land, were more or less common throughout the game. In a 4-player game, sure, they're all going to come out by the end, but if you're playing with 2 or 3 players or even the solo mode, you're going to be removing a chunk of the tiles, so again, that adds a bit of that randomness to not knowing what's been removed and what's still left. And the other thing is, as you go throughout the game, you're never going to get through this whole bag of wildlife tokens. So some games you might get a lot of one type or might not see much of another type. So there's a lot of these unknowns that you're kind of juggling on every turn, and there's all kinds of new information that's going to be, especially with the higher player count, as it comes back around, the game state and what's available to you will change quite a bit from turn to turn. The other thing I want to mention is because you know at the start of the game that you have 20 turns, there's going to be a point near the end where, let's say you're 14, 15, 16 turns in, and you might have completed some of these scoring objectives. And by that I mean, some of these ones that have like a maximum, like again for the Hawks, you have 8 of them for a max of 26 points. So you might have a few turns left and you might think, okay, well, now I don't really want to get any more Hawks, but there's other categories where you can start a new sort of set. So let's say you got your Elks. Let's say you already scored 4 Elks for 13 points for that straight line somewhere. Well, if you have 4 or 5 turns left, are you going to start another straight line of Elks? So, if there's one Elk tile out there and you can place it on your board, if you end up with just the one Elk, that's only going to get you 2 points. So you have to sort of hedge your bets on, okay, what new, I've already maxed out on my Hawks, I've completed this thing of Elks, I've, maxed out on my Salmon, where am I going to try and get points? And again, you're playing with that randomness of how many turns do I have left, what's on the board, and you're trying to come up with a plan as to, okay, based on the likelihood of what's still out there, how likely am I to accomplish something if I start a new goal? Should I be trying to just grab points elsewhere? Should I be trying to, focus more on my wild or my habitat types to maximize and get the majorities for those? So there's a lot of this unknown that's still left near the end, and I really like the game arc that creates by not only the combination of scoring conditions, but just the randomness of the tiles and everything and the order that all comes up in. And another thing I want to focus on here real quick is the nature tokens. So I like it when games kind of hide the scoring, so to speak. Games where everything is, you can just calculate and say, well, if I go here, it's this many points. If I go here, it's this many points. Then it's just sort of a matter of time. Eventually, you're going to figure out what gets you the most points, and you're probably going to go with that option. And one of the things I love about this is these nature tokens. At first, this seemed like such a subtle, inconsequential thing to me. The first time I played the game, I didn't think much of them. And other games that, Flat Out are associated with, whether it's the main Flat Out crew of Molly Johnson, Sean Stankovic, and Robert Melvin, whether they're designing the games or they're working on the development side of things, they often have these types of ways to mitigate the randomness from the kind of draw options in the middle. And what I like about the way these nature tokens are implemented is, because it's worth a point at the end of the game. Let's say there was a way that, you just had a stack of spare tiles you could pick from to just say, oh, if I'm trading in the nature token, I'm just going to place this thing that I want to place. if you had more control over it, the nature tokens wouldn't be as interesting and the choices wouldn't be as difficult, because you know that by sacrificing it to use it, you're losing a point. But if you could just right away say, oh, well, I'll use this nature token and I can get 4 points if I do this with it, or I can get this many points if I do this with it, or I can get this many points, then it would just be, okay, if I'm going to get 3 points but lose 1, the net gain is 2, and it would just be kind of a no-brainer. But because the options with the nature token, I mean, one of the ways you can use them is to take a combination of a tile and a token, but even then, that might, you don't know how many points that's going to end up giving you at the end of the game, unless it's maybe your final turn and you already know that the game's going to end right away. But otherwise, again, it's this kind of hedging your bets. Like, yes, it might get me 2 points now, but also if I were to save this nature token for a future turn, could I get more points for it later? And the other thing is, because you can use it to, which actually happens fairly commonly, is to just wipe a certain number of tokens from the board, you're trading in the token for an opportunity, or almost for an opportunity to have more opportunity. There's no guarantees. This could end up backfiring on you. So it's always an interesting choice on, first of all, whether to use the nature token, because you don't know what it's going to do for you short term as well as long term, but also how to use it. So I really like the way these are implemented, because the rules of how to use them are so simple. But again, throughout the game, as you have these nature tokens in your supply, it's this very limited resource, because again, you only get them from placing a wildlife token on one of these keystone habitat tiles. So even if you have, 3 or 4 throughout the game, I don't think I've ever seen anyone holding more than 4 or 5 at a time. You might be having this limited supply and you're trying to think, okay, I have 7 turns left and I've got 2 nature tokens. Is this the right time to use it? Is there going to be a more, is my back going to be up against the wall more later, where I have a better opportunity to use it and kind of mitigate that randomness and get rid of that in a way that, gives me better options? So now let's talk about how player count affects randomness and just player count in the game in general. So I mentioned to you before, when you're playing this game, that every player is going to get 20 turns. So if you're playing solo, the entire game is 20 turns, because you're just cycling out extra tiles and stuff from the market, but you're still just playing your 20 turns. You're not handling an AI player. If you play with 2 players, of course, each player getting 20 turns, so 40. Upwards of, if you play a 4-player game, and there's a total of 80 turns, you're only getting 20 of those. So you're, a quarter of the time you're playing, and the other 3/4 of the time or other players' turns. So from turn to turn, as you go and then 3 other players go, what's available to you in the market is going to change a lot more. You can't on your turn say, well, if I take this, then maybe on my next turn I'll take this pair or I'll take that. You can't really plan ahead on anything. So with more players, there's definitely more randomness and you have less control over what's going on the board. Whereas on the, let's say 2-player side of things, if you take something, you have a good idea of what's still going to be out there on your turn. You might have, might be able to kind of guess as to what your opponent's going to take, but you have more control over that in a 2-player game. The other thing is, with 3 or 4 players competing with multiple players over different land types for majorities and depending which tiles come up and all that kind of stuff, there's just going to be a lot less out of your control. So for those who have maybe mentioned that the game was either too much randomness, they felt like they were frustrated by the luck of the draw kind of thing. Maybe you were playing with 3 or 4 players, and maybe you'll enjoy the game most if you play it solo or with 2. On the other side of the spectrum, if you felt like you were, getting too good at the game, or you felt too easy, or you wanted it to feel more tactical, where every turn felt a little bit tougher to make those choices, then you might want to play more on the higher end with 3 or 4 players. Just keep in mind that will lead to a little more downtime. And I will say, similar as I mentioned when I reviewed Calico, which is also a collaboration between AEG and Flat Out Games, is that I think the game probably works best at 2 players, maybe with 3 as well. The solo mode's also really good. That solo to 3 is all very, very close in how well the game plays, I would say. Adding a 4th player just, again, it slows it down without adding a whole lot more intrigue or excitement to the game. I think adding playing with 2 or 3 instead of solo definitely has a lot of positives. Adding a 4th player, the game still works well because it's a fairly quick playing game. Even with 4, you can teach and play this in under an hour. So no matter what the player count is, I think it's great, but I think it's probably best at 2 or 3. And I just find it interesting how the difference of randomness applies depending on the player count that you're playing at. Now, normally at this point of a review, even when I'm reviewing games that I really like, I try to be as critical as possible. I try and point out, yeah, this could be better kind of thing. Cascadia is a really, really tough game to criticize. My biggest complaint is probably what I mentioned, is just that I have very little incentive to want to play the game at 4 players just because it adds that amount of downtime. So, maybe I wish the game could scale slightly better with 4 players, but really I'm kind of just reaching for anything to criticize here, because the game is so well polished, and this is kind of one of the hallmarks of anything that you see this Flat Out Games logo on, is their games always feel like they're very well developed. All the kind of, any potential fluff, any fiddliness in the rules, anything extra that doesn't belong feels like it's been kind of ruthlessly cut out of the game to make it the most simplified, kind of clean, smooth playing, most polished experience possible. And it's something I really appreciate that I think Flat Out really nails on all of their games, whether it's, Point Salad, Calico, Cascadia, whatever the case may be. And I think that's a big reason why it is where it is on the Board Game Geek rankings. Again, this game just came out last year. As of now, it is currently number 123 on the all-time Board Game Geek rankings, with an average rating of 8.1, and that's after only 6,000 ratings. So for those who don't check, if you go ahead and look at all the games that are ahead of Cascadia, or go look through a bunch of them, you'll see that most of those games have a lower average than 8.1, and usually have a lot more ratings than just 6,000. And the way the BGG rankings work, it often if a game needs a certain number of rankings, the more ratings it has, the higher it's going to move up on the list. So it's only a matter of time before this game cracks the top 100, could crack the top 50, could even go higher. Like, I really do think this is sort of a modern day classic. This is a game that I think will still be played and talked about among the better tile laying games at least a decade from now, probably more. It's one of the rare games where you see a game that has a weight rating on BGG below a 2.0 crack the top 100. The top 100 tends to gravitate towards those heavier games. The kind of classic argument is that, people who have been in the hobby the longest and are playing the heaviest games are more likely to be on Board Game Geek reviewing games and ranking games compared to, maybe a more casual gamer who tends to enjoy lighter games kind of thing. So this is why you see so many games like, Gloomhaven, Terraforming Mars, Spirit Island, Brass Birmingham, all these kinds of games, War of the Ring, near the top of the list, very heavy games. There's only a few games like Azul and that kind of thing that actually crack the top 100 with simple rules, and typically those tend to be games that are very approachable for, newer or more experienced gamers or people who prefer light gamers, but still have enough kind of meat on the bones, enough satisfaction for people who are used to playing heavy strategy games, longer games. And anywhere you look, people who tend to gravitate towards those heavier games, who are trying Cascadia, tend to really enjoy it. And I think it's one of those truly unique games that has that kind of perfect crossover between the appeal to kind of the lightest of gamers and the heaviest of gamers, that they can play with their own groups, and they can also kind of cross paths and play this game together and still enjoy it. It's ranked already as the number 1 abstract game on Board Game Geek, ahead of Azul. It's the number 12 ranked family game. There's a reason why this game is just shooting up the list all over the place, and I think it's got that addictive kind of one more try kind of feel. The same way that when you play a roll and write game and at the end you always feel like, I could have done better, like the Ganz Schön Clever games or whatever, those kind of games where every time you finish you think, I could have been more efficient, I could have done better, I want to play again to do that. And the reason why that happens in Cascadia is because of the randomness, because if you just had a stack of tiles in your own possession and you could choose when to put them out there, at the beginning you would just make a plan based on the scoring cards, and you'd have a lot of control over what you're doing. And if you got an awesome score because you saw your plan to fruition, then what's the point of coming back to the game, right? The randomness is what gives you that little bit of frustration and keeps everything just outside of your grasp and makes you want to keep coming back to see if you can find the best ways to mitigate that randomness, find the best timing to veer off the course a little bit, or when to use that nature token, or in which way and which scoring conditions to go for when, based on what has or hasn't come out on the board. There's just a lot to consider on every single turn, and the game always surprises me with that. Every time I play it, I think, okay, this time the decisions are going to be easier. I'm kind of a Cascadia veteran now, and I sit there looking over my moves, my options, and it always feels like the decisions are tough. Everyone I've shown this game to has loved it. Highly recommend Cascadia. Absolutely one of the best releases of 2021. One of the best tile laying games out there, and it's all thanks to the basically perfectly executed aspect of randomness in this game. So that's all I've got to say about Cascadia. I hope you enjoyed this review. If you liked it, please consider liking the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Pop on over to our Discord channel. We've got a bursting community there, over 200 people already, just chatting about games all the time. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.